Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. In February of 1997, this sheep from Scotland was hailed by many as visible proof of a startling scientific tour de force. Dolly was the first cloned mammal ever. But an argument erupted. What if a day comes when we can clone human beings? Will human cloning take society somewhere it doesn't want to go? Or is it a valuable technique we may one day take for granted? Joining us to cut through the double talk are Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, Professor of Medical Ethics at the Harvard University Medical School, a member of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, and author of The Ends of Human Life. Dr. Norman Fost, Professor of Pediatrics and Director of the Program in Medical Ethics at the University of Wisconsin. Professor Karen Rothenberg, Professor of Law and Director of the Law and Health Care Program at the University of Maryland, and Peter Brown of the New York Academy of Sciences and editor of The Sciences magazine, the most recent issue of which is entitled The Promise and Peril of Cloning. The topic before this House: should we be sheepish about cloning? This week on Think Tank. Just imagine a world where cloning was possible. Now look, the economy is headed for a golden age, better, unless now don't interrupt. Economists screw it up. All right, look, quiet. Now look, both of you. First, Hugo, let's get a conservative view on this, and then Hugo will get a liberal view. But in reality, of course, cloning is less like Xeroxing people and more like making identical twins. How does it work? Dr. Ian Wilmot and his team at the Roslin Institute in Scotland started with a 6-year-old sheep. They took a single cell from her mammary gland, including the nucleus, the command center, which contains all the genes and the DNA. Then they took an unfertilized egg from a second sheep. They removed the egg's nucleus and replaced it with the cell from the first sheep. The egg and its new nucleus were then fused together, turning it into an embryo, but with all the genetic characteristics of the first sheep. In effect, a genetic twin of that first sheep. All that was left to do was to put this developing embryo into a third sheep, which then gave birth to Dolly. The arrival of Dolly prompted President Clinton to call for a National Bioethics Advisory Committee to study both the science and the ethics involved.
There is much about cloning that we still do not know.
After 3 months, the NBAC issued a report calling for a 5-year moratorium on human cloning. But many scientists are skeptical of this skepticism. Dr. Robert Wachbroit.
The initial reaction to cloning, the initial apparently negative reaction to cloning, I believe is, in fact, an initial reaction to something quite new. In part, perhaps based on misunderstandings of what the genetics is, in part based on science fiction scenarios that have filled a lot of people's imagination of what cloning would amount to. But I believe that once becomes more broadly known what cloning is, it'll be as accepted as many other assisted reproductive technologies.
And after all, when you think of it, cloning itself is not even a new concept. Dr. Michael McClure, chairman of the Reproductive Sciences branch at the National Institutes of Health.
The history of the idea of cloning is not really that new. It dates back to fossil records in the Caucasus Mountains in Georgia, in what is the Soviet Union bloc that we used to think of. And in that case, it was applied to viticulture approaches, which were vines. I performed my first cloning experiment without realizing it myself in about 1954 when I cut a small worm in half. It was a little cross-eyed guy called a planarian, and it has great regeneration powers, and they're polar. So if you cut it in half, the head will regenerate a tail, and the tail will regenerate a head. And what you end up with is two individuals, which I didn't think of as clones at the time, but in fact that's a kind of cloning.
Okay, so which is it?
You know, after looking at the nose, I get the feeling that what we ought to do perhaps is postpone the cloning.
Would cloning humans go too far, or is this just one more important step on the path of scientific discovery? Gentlemen, lady, thank you for joining us. Let's go around the room quickly. Was the advent of Dolly a major scientific breakthrough, or was a lot of it just hype?
Well, it is a major scientific breakthrough. It's a very important advance and helps us understand how genes work, how genes that you thought were turned off could be turned back on, and how all that can happen in the mammal, which had never been done before. I don't think the science is the key element of Dolly, however.
I think it was of a big magnitude, actually I admit bigger than I thought initially. And I guess I would agree with Zeke that it probably isn't only the science so much, but the ability of science to really get at our core of what it means to be human. And some would see it along a continuum in our scientific developments. Some would see it as a new breaking point between the difference between reproduction and replication.
I agree. I think that the science of it was probably a continuation of what had gone before. People have been cloning animals, amphibians, mammals for 40 years. Clones have existed, as we all know, identical twins. I would compare it, though, in its possibility for mobilizing public attention to perhaps the invention of the transistor. People don't know what it will be, but it may have profound impact on people's lives.
Okay, Norman Fost.
Well, I think the scientific aspects are going to be the major part. I think it is a major advance scientifically. It opens the door to, as Zeke said, to understanding a lot that we don't know about human or mammalian biology, how cells work, how they differentiate, and so on. I think the social implications are not going to be all that profound. I think there will be some benefits when and if human cloning becomes possible. I think the risks are wildly overstated. I don't think it's going to be a big deal on the social front down the road.
Let's go through some of the science, because there are many people in the audience and at least one person on this little platform who doesn't understand this very well. That's me, about the science. How likely is it that this technique originated in Scotland will one day be usable to clone human beings?
Probably guaranteed. I don't think the fact that we were able to do it in sheep and no one was able to predict it, I think, is very good evidence that one should be loath to predict that science can't do something.
Okay, how long a time frame are we talking about?
Shorter rather than longer. I mean, I'd be surprised if 3 to 5 years from now, absent restrictions, if it weren't biologically possible to clone a human.
We have to make a distinction, though, between cloning from an embryo cell, which is the way most cloning has been done, and cloning from an adult. The only adult that I can think of that has been cloned is Dolly, whereas a lot of animals, rabbits, sheep, cattle, goats, monkeys, have all been cloned from embryonic cells. It's pretty easy to take an embryo cell and implant it and get it to differentiate.
Well,
it's harder to do the adult.
Well, a commercial breeding farm in Wisconsin a couple of months ago did clone a cow. It was a fetal cow, but it was very far along in development.
One of the problems to understand is that as cells develop, as an organism ages, some of the genes get shut off, and we thought irreversibly, just permanently shut down. So in your skin cell, they no longer have genes for lots of other parts of the body. What we didn't know before Dolly is whether we could turn them back on, all those shut down genes back on. So taking a cell from an adult, you have to turn on all those early genes. the earlier you take a cell, that nucleus, from an embryo or a fetus, the easier it is to turn them on. And we knew from before you could turn them on.
Are we saying that when the day comes when human cloning is doable, that somebody could come up and nick me here, take a cell, and do its tricks, and end up replicating my genetic structure from a little? Is that what we're talking about?
There's a big divide between cloning to create a full human being, and one of the advantages may be being able to take your skin cell and make it a bone marrow cell or some other kind of cell that could have great therapeutic uses. For example, bone marrow transplantation or liver transplantation. And I think that, from a sort of ethical and social standpoint, is not worrisome. I mean, that's the advance of science for new therapies. What is worrisome is being able to take a skin cell and make a baby out of it. And that, I think, is an important difference that people need to keep in mind, in part so that if we're worried about creating babies, we don't also prohibit very important therapeutic science.
Let us go on to some of the ethical problems. Are we heading down a perilous path here?
If we were to take one of your wonderful cells, Ben, and find a woman who was interested in incubating it, and you wouldn't have...
Possibly for financial reasons. I mean, sort of a rent-a-womb kind of thing.
Well, let's take it for the best reasons. Let's say somebody who just wanted to, maybe you have a young bride and you together want to have a child, and this is one way you want to do it. Let's assume high motivation for all the reasons people want to be parents. That this child has physical characteristics will certainly resemble you very closely is going to be a tiny part of this child's determination of his future. That is, the personality is what we're concerned about, whether this individual is going to think of themselves as a person. And they're going to be completely different from you. They're going to be raised in a completely different world in which you were raised, different parents than yours, different time, different age, different friends, different everything. There's not a chance in the world that this person is going to be an identical twin of you, anything like the resemblance we see between identical twins. But they may have certain characteristics that you have, just like our sons and our daughters do, but you wouldn't be able to predict at all whether this person is going to turn out to be a professional football player, a journalist, a doctor, or a bum.
Likely not a professional basketball player.
Well, first, that's an important comment. There are some things where physical characteristics have very strong influence on your possibilities. We know, right, you just said it, you couldn't be a professional basketball player just because of height, and that has a big, strong genetic determinant. But I think there's other ways of...
If you took a person who was 7 feet tall and a great athlete and cloned from that cell, you would get a 7-foot-tall person.
Well, we don't know if exactly 7 foot, but tall. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in theory, exactly.
Right.
I mean,
a lot of it is under genetic control.
Parents control for these qualities already. That we pick our partners because we're interested in certain qualities which have a heavy genetic...
but that's taking one very small
and
piece
it's pretty random.
That genetic
and it's
material.
Random in the end.
It's random in the
but
end.
But I think there's another point which really needs to be looked at. Norm is, there's no reason, or cloning is never the only mechanism to reproduce. And it's very important to recognize that. You don't have to use cloning. There are lots of other technologies that one could use. So to opt for cloning, I want this DNA, means the person already, first of all, has some narcissistic qualities. I want this characteristic or my characteristics. Second, they have a certain expectation about what they want.
Like all of us.
And that expectation...
Like all of us.
No, well, but much more control to...
It's a control issue.
Much more control to create it. And it's that. I'm going to evaluate the child by whether they meet these expectations. I want a Mozart. So if the kid isn't a Mozart,
that's
what's going to happen?
There are lots of examples of a family situation that I can think of, at least, that where it might be a very smart idea or an ethical idea to introduce a clone. For example, two lesbians want each to have a genetically related offspring. They don't want to introduce outside genetic material into the family unit. We all recognize the rights, the desires in our society for people to form a family and to make that family out of the genetic material of the people there. What about single parents? What about imagine a situation in
But
which
it's important to say
someone...
it's not the only method of reproducing. What it is, it suddenly becomes the only method to reproduce with this specific genetic quality. And that's an important rider. We recognize...
We can
wait
always...
a second,
we can
we recognize
have,
a right to reproduce, to have children, and all of that goes with it. To raise them, to go through the crises with them, to have them mature. But cloning is different. It's to have a right to reproduce with this specific genetic endowment.
But
that's what you
sometimes for a
want.
very...
So you would say that
And
you have to adopt.
I don't think that's the same.
But the only option for some people is to adopt. And I
Well,
agree that
there are
adoption
other-
should be done.
Wait a second. There's artificial insemination.
But
right?
that
There's
introduces
surrogate motherhood.
outside genetic material.
Well, so does
But see,
I
adoption.
think it's the paradigm you set up in all this debate. We could set up a paradigm that would make this argument very sympathetic, and we could set up a paradigm that could make us very sympathetic when you're dealing with genetic diseases and taking the genetic expression and then just making it a little healthier or a little better. We do get on a slippery slope about values and what we're willing to control and what we're not willing to control. But in the end, it does come to this sense of control. And I think Zeke's point is, if we give people that ability, yes, it happens. Yes, we like
Oh, it
our kids
happens.
to go to the college we went to and we want them
It's
to be
ubiquitous.
successful. But we're sending a message in society about how much of that control we're willing to support or not support.
Zeke paints a worst-case scenario which presently occurs over and over again. Todd Marinovich, the great Southern Cal quarterback, was created to be a quarterback. We followed this in Life magazine for 20 years. His father had nothing in mind but for him to be a pro quarterback, and he shaped his whole life. So there's let me finish.
Martina Hingis.
It doesn't follow that parents who want to clone a child are going to be like Mr. Marinovich or have that kind of perverse notion. And by the way, we don't regulate the Marinovich's behavior. We don't have congressional bans on parents doing stuff like that. But suppose Ben's wife had Huntington's disease, and they didn't want to pass that on, but they wanted to have a child that was genetically related to them. And yeah, there are other ways of doing it, but this might be one way of doing it. It might turn out to be one of the more efficient down the road.
Let me ask a question.
Just let me finish this point.
Okay.
It doesn't follow that because Ben chooses to clone himself for this reason, that he's going to be like Mr. Marinovich, that he's going to be controlling, that he's going to want to dominate, or even that he's doing this to predict the child's outcome. He may be that he'll be a wonderful father in the usual ways.
Let me just ask, what about some of these horribles? Boys from Brazil, somebody with an inordinate amount of money and a lot of power says, I don't want to just replicate me once. I want to replicate me 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. I want a country, the United States of America, with 266 million me's.
That's the problem with this, much of the cloning discussion, and I think that's why the scientific news made such a big headline when it broke. People see the boys from Brazil, they see movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We have teenagers telling Parade magazine interviewers that we don't know what's going down the street. He might not even have a soul. It comes right out of the movies.
You are the living duplicate of the greatest man in history. Adolf Hitler.
And one of the problems we have in this debate, it seems to me, is we've been doing this now for a relatively short amount of time in human history, a decade and a half maybe. The ability for society to understand, the ability for us to incorporate it culturally and its social and cultural ramifications, we haven't had enough time. One of the things I'm particularly worried about is how we view children. Do we view them more like things we have that are meant to satisfy our desires, or are we supposed to cultivate them now? Of course, Norm and everyone can come up with bad examples. And he gave us an example which he called perverse, right? Raising a kid from day one to be a quarterback. He said it was perverse. Now, I agree with that moral evaluation. One of the questions we have to ask is, are we going to enhance the opportunities for it? Are we, more importantly, going to condone that kind of behavior?
This doesn't enhance the opportunity. Parents can do that all by themselves without cloning.
This also creates a social understanding that says that kind of control is all right. It's normatively good behavior because we're going to permit it and encourage it.
I'm not clear why you're linking cloning with this issue for control. That is, parents who want to control their kids, which are legion, are among us now. I don't see how you jump to the assumption that somebody who wants to clone their kid for some important reason, such as the ones we've mentioned, would necessarily be a controlling person.
What it sounds like to me is that you're making a kind of cost-benefit analysis, that we shouldn't put money into cloning research because what it's going to lead to is only this enhanced control over our children, statistical though it might be. But if you go into that argument, then you have to look at the benefits side of it.
Tell us your argument, but it's got to be brief because we're running out of time.
It's not about cost benefit. It's about the social understanding that we say is okay.
No, but when you say social understanding, may I read that as a request for government intervention in these decisions, social, society, non-individual?
Government intervenes all the time to say what is good, encourage good things and discourage bad things.
And so you want the government involved in deciding who can have children in what manner?
No, I didn't say that.
Well, when you say social, when you say social, I mean, what are you talking about?
I'm saying by condoning cloning, saying it's an acceptable mode of reproduction, that we're not going to do anything about it and allow the market to take its place and have it. We're saying that it's okay, not only is it okay, it's a good thing for parents to control as much as possible the genetic and other characteristics of their children, that kind of control is good. And more importantly, we will begin to say, it's bad if you don't control like that.
I don't see why we're saying that. Well, there are lots of things we're saying with any activity. One of the implications might be that. We're certainly not saying that.
I'll give you an example. That's what's happened with reproductive.
And it's intent that matters here.
No, I think that's in fact a very important point, that there does go from let the free market, let it happens, to it becoming almost an obligation in society. And you look at artificial reproduction and assisted reproduction. And there are many people in our society building on the cues from the context that they have a duty. If they can't get pregnant, they follow along this until it happens.
And they're a failure.
And they're a failure in our society. And I think that there is a difference between controlling that quarterback and this technology, because this allows you a different set of tools to do it.
Okay. This is 1997. I decree it is now 2007. It is 10 years from now. Where are we going to be? What will have happened? What would 5 clones of us sitting around, or
God help us.
Where are we going to be 10 years from now in this? And give me a brief answer if you can.
I think the technology will have advanced considerably. We'll be able to clone cells and probably create bone marrow from skin cells. I think cloning of human beings will be prohibited in the Western world, but that won't prevent 1 or 2 cases which will receive a lot of opprobrium.
Karen?
I think that most of the world will prohibit it. I agree with that. And I think if it happens in this country, there'll be a market. That it won't be something that will be done in a research context at all. It will be done underground, and we'll actually then not know too much about it. In fact, it could be going on right now and we wouldn't know. I doubt it, but it could be. How would we know?
Peter?
I think there will be attempts to control too much of the research that may go into understanding the kinds of things that would go on in human cloning. And so after a time, those fears will become lessened. They will back off, as they have with the first round of genetic engineering in 1979, I believe. There was a lot of fear that we were going to have released monsters into the environment. We put together understandings and rules, and none of it turned out to be anywhere nearly as threatening as anybody thought it was.
Norm?
When you prohibit things legally, you drive them underground and you create a black market. And I think if there's a long-term congressional ban, it'll just drive it offshore or into some underground method. And I think that biologically it will be possible to clone humans 10 years from now. And the question is whether we're going to do it in a way that we can regulate and monitor it and follow it. So for that reason, I hope we don't have a long-term permanent ban on it.
Okay. Thank you, Ezekiel Emanuel, Norm Fost, Karen Rothenberg, and Peter Brown. And thank you. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.